you want to ask me questions? How is this? How we're gonna set this
So
up?
I figured you would simply emote.
I didn't know. Am I answering like a yeah?
No, no,
So
no,
once
no,
again,
right
this is
there.
this is ideally designed to get whatever it is that you think is going to go into the video. So like,
I was hoping,
got me
okay, so I've got about 6 or 7 videos in so far.
right.
I'm encouraging people just to talk about about the work and Aaron Allston and how they feel about it, for
Okay.
as long as you're comfortable with it. It's coming
Right.
in varying lengths from varying people. So if you want to talk,
Well, do we want to talk about Aaron
if
personally
you want
for
to talk
this?
about
About
Aaron personally, I will probably talk far less about Strikeforce than I will about the experience of retrieving the Strikeforce archive.
Sure, right, yeah.
So-
Well, that's your story for
Yeah.
this, right?
So
Exactly.
this
I wouldn't
has
get
to be
into
like
that.
You and Aaron, or you and Strikeforce.
Right.
Why you believe it's important, or why you believe he was important, and why people should support the project.
Right.
You could talk for a minute, you could talk for 20.
Right.
But it's not going to be a Q&A.
Right. Okay.
None of them are Q&A.
All right. Well, but if there is a topic you want me to hit or something you say, hey, wait a minute, go back. That was wander down that path for a while or whatever. Do that so that I know, what's useful for you.
Okay. So.
I mean, I first encountered Strikeforce, or whatever. We can do it that way from a.
I would like to hear your Casablanca explanation.
Well, I'll get to that for yeah, but I want to like lead into that. That's not something I can kind of.
Explain why in the 80s it wasn't a given that there was just this institutional body of knowledge in how to run
Right.
campaigns. Why there weren't like all maybe for fantasy, but not for any other genre.
And rarely even
Probably
for
not
fantasy, right? Yeah,
There weren't a lot of books saying, okay, so you and your friends want to play this one campaign for a decade.
Right.
Here's useful information on how that might functionally work.
actual play. I mean, the how
Actual play.
Strikeforce more or less invented actual play, right?
Actual
Yeah,
play.
exactly.
And so people were guessing at it, but
Right.
it wasn't a book you could go get and read it.
Exactly.
This is it. This is
So,
the next
so one of the things that's amazing. I mean, of the many things that are amazing about Strikeforce and about Aaron's work for it was that he did in fact generally invent or shape the use of actual play. That's become recognized today as a vital part of learning about games and of learning how to be a GM, how to be a player, how to work together to create a campaign, and take into account the actual, not like the idealized space of an RPG for this, but what actually happened in practice, right? That you would have different kinds of players who would come to a game with different kinds of agendas, different ideas about what was fun, and how to access that, how to make sure that the experience was as fun as possible for everybody involved, and to identify kinds of players and sets of desires and responses, to a game that people would be looking for, and how to satisfy them. That portion of Strikeforce is only about 10 pages long, and it's the most concentratedly intense 10 pages of brilliance, in any given product that I can think of. It would be my first example when I'm talking, teaching people about games for it, is what he managed to cram into those 10 pages that first time that wound up being reprinted over and over again in a number of different locations, and the advice that he gave, was retold and promulgated throughout the gaming industry. That first time kind of like breakdown of types of players and how to satisfy them, and like how to get certain kinds of effects at your table by playing them. And the metaphor I always use is for somebody to watch Casablanca today. Here it is 70 years later, somebody sits down to watch Casablanca for the first time, and they can't really understand what the big deal is. Oh, that was a perfectly lovely movie, but really it was just one long set of cliches. And that's the reaction that you sometimes get when you ask somebody today, 25, 30 years later, to sit down and read Strikeforce. They're like, well, that was kind of nice. Yeah, it's but I've read all that before. Yeah, you've read all that before because it was in Aaron's book first, and we have all kind of accepted it. That's spread throughout the industry, so, throughout gaming, as these are best practices. And there had never been a book through any of the game systems that were popular at the time that gave you that kind of advice, that gave you that, none of the early D&D books gave you how to manage a table full of players, separate advice from how to play the game, right? And Champions in particular, the Strikeforce in particular, sat down and said, I'm speaking to you as Aaron Allston, as a GM, as somebody with this experience who has, created these campaigns and these well-loved campaigns, and I'm telling you how I did it. And I'm doing that on a conversational level with you that had never, that Gary or Dave or any of these other writers or, The Traveler, any other book, never gave you that kind of like very personal connection to somebody who was trying to teach you how to GM. And nobody had ever done a generic book that wasn't system connected about GM advice. So it was, that 10 pages of Strikeforce. The rest of Strikeforce is pretty great too. Pardon me. But what is truly unique about it, I believe, is that this is how I did it. And so all of these kind of like techniques that we almost take for granted, as just, yes, this is how you do things for it, of playing away from the table, of blue booking. He named blue booking. I mean, that's enormous. You have to, understand that that's where that concept came from. And so when you sit down and read, his advice today, if you pick up a copy of Strikeforce today, you are reading kind of the text that all of that advice that has now been spread out, that is part of like the story game industry, that's part of, narrativist gaming for it. Really, that's where the kernel of all of that is.
Great.
How's that? Okay.
Yeah, that went really well.
Okay.
That's excellent.
I think I got a couple of nice different angles so you can like multi-count.
Now you can say, was I supposed to be recording that?
Yeah, right, exactly, yeah. Yeah,